Hi everyone, my name is Valerie Boudreau, and today, for discussion 6, I decided that after reading the chapters that it would be kind of cool to do this as like a podcast style. So basically, what's going to happen is I've decided that I'm going to talk about chapters 31 through 34, and for each chapter, I am going to break down the key takeaways that I took from it, talk about how it could relate to our webinar project, and also I chose application questions that I could modify to be specific to my content area. So you will notice that all of my questions are based on being a second grade special education teacher because that's currently what I do. So basically, for chapter 31, it was the hybrid classroom design. So this chapter introduced the electronic synchronous multi-site learning, which blends in-person learning with remote learners, and you're using things like smart technology such as cameras, AI enhanced microphones. I think what stood out to me the most about this specific chapter was how intentional the classroom design was so that you can reduce the feeling of isolation, you're increasing engagement, and especially for learners who need that flexibility. I think that as an educator, our main focus is trying to engage our students and make learning fun and learning memorable. As terms of being in my classroom, I can see the potential for a hybrid setup. I think that it could very well support my IEP students who sometimes end up needing to learn from home. Basically, they learn from home because, the environment of the school might not be working for that specific day or vice versa. So there are some cases where we end up sending kids home and using Zoom, using the interactive whiteboards, you're able to still connect with them using live instruction, which I think is so cool. I also really liked the part where it talked about using paraprofessionals as facilitators. I think that in like a hybrid environment, they're not only there to support the students and keeping them engaged, they're also helping manage the cognitive workload. So as far as chapter 31 in relation to our webinar and our webinar project, our webinar project is for the most part done, but there are ways that I could see it going and changing based on these different topics. So basically, from a teacher productivity standpoint, the hybrid model, like the electronic synchronous multi-site learning, shows how AI-enabled classroom tech can automate the process of the instruction, combining it with the classroom management. Basically, I think that in our webinar, we do a really good job of highlighting these different tools and specifically how they support inclusive teaching. And you will see that in our webinar based on one of the interactive videos that I actually do in the webinar. As far as we'll transition to chapter 32. So chapter 32 was learning with podcasts, and this is kind of one of the reasons that I wanted to do this podcast was because after I read this chapter, I was like, oh, that'd be so cool to kind of do my discussion post as a podcast. So basically, I think that podcasts are flexible, they're accessible, and I also think that they're great for differentiated instruction. Before reading this chapter, never actually thought about it this way, but I have done some podcast-esque stuff with my students. Not only do podcasts help with the consumption of the content, but it also helps with the creation. I've had my students on many occasions who hate writing or struggle to write kind of do an audio to kind of gauge what they're learning, and they are able to go in and record what they're thinking instead of having to write it down. Now, in terms of the consumption aspect of it, I think that that's a little bit different, only because I can do vocab review, I can do test review, but I have to make sure that what I'm giving them as a podcast is kind of on their level and easy for them to understand. Um, I really think after reading this chapter that I want to kind of start having them podcast and do book talks. I think that that would be a really good way to kind of use the podcasting platform to kind of get them to, talk about books, share their love of learning. And I think that I took that from this chapter, and I think that that's a really good thing to implement in my classroom. As far as relating it to the webinar, um, I think that this is another situation where it's not really most podcasts are not an AI tool, but it does kind of relate to the AI tools in the sense that, like, it does save time and you can personalize the learning. I can create a podcast for each one of my students to listen to that kind of meets them where they are. So I think that is kind of the connection between our webinar and podcasting. So let's move on to chapter 33. So chapter 33 was social media and instructional design. So this chapter obviously explored how social media supports the network knowledge activities, like collecting, curating, and sharing resources. It also talked about how the power of professional learning networks. As a special education teacher, my immediate thought when I was reading this chapter was related back to another assignment I did, actually with Professor Kennedy, where we had to join a online learning platform and kind of go through the platform and figure out what conversations are being started in this online platform, what's going on. And I immediately thought of the platform that I joined, which was I joined a Facebook group, and it was for resource teachers, behavior teachers. And in that group, we shared so many different online resources. We shared so many tips and tricks. But I think one of the biggest things that stuck out to me, in that group was that this one person in the group decided that they were going to create a new app to track data, and they wanted us all to test it. And I ended up using it in my own classroom, and I tested it, and I was able to give her so much feedback on how it was useful or not useful. And I think that just how big social media is now, it was so cool that I was able to give feedback to this random stranger about an app that she created to make special education teachers' lives easier. In terms of the webinar relevance, I think it kind of ties back into what I was just talking about. It's such a powerful tool, and you're able to promote different tools. They could be AI tools. In the example I just gave, it wasn't an AI tool, but you're building these teacher communities, and as AI gets bigger, I think that there will be conversations around like Magic School and different AI platforms. And I think that, we might turn it into, let's make Pinterest boards of all the different AI tools we've used in our classrooms. So the last chapter that I'm going to talk about is chapter 34, which was artificial intelligence, So this chapter was obviously the most relevant to our webinar. I think that AI just brings so much creativity and it's not a replacement for teachers. It can just boost the productivity, and this is all things that we will be talking about in our webinar when it's time to present. I think it's so cool because for our webinar project, I'm actually going to use Copilot to do something with some IEP goals and objectives, so that'll be really exciting to see. But I also think that using it to analyze student feedback is so important. It helps it so that we're being more productive, but you still obviously have to come back to the fact that you still have to look at it, make sure it's correct, make sure it's right. I think that's kind of like where the gray area is right now, is that a lot of teachers and people are using it for it to save them time, but we're not really in the stage of like, okay, we need to realize that we kind of need to make sure we're reading it and going over it to make sure that it actually aligns with what we're trying to do. If you put in information about a student and ask it to write a goal and you don't read it over, your goal might not align with the student at all. So I'm really excited for our webinar, and I'm really excited for you to see all those things, and I definitely think that Chapter 34 really did a good job of talking about AI, and I'm excited to talk about it in our webinar. So just to kind of like end the podcast, I actually was asking ChatGPT for some names of this podcast to see what it would come up with. And one of the things that it came up with was designing for an impact, which I thought was really cool. I really enjoyed these chapters. I really do think that these chapters really tied into instructional design in a very relevant way. You know, talking about podcasts, social media, talking about AI, these are all things that are ever changing in our society right now. So it was cool to see how we can instructionally design with the things that are relevant in our community right now. I really hope that you enjoyed this new way of me doing my discussion posts, and I would appreciate any feedback on it, and I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say.